Hello, we are Sanne de Bel and Jasper Nize, and we are students at Universidad Pablo de Olavide. Our professor is Maria José del Pino Espejo, and we are going to read chapter 5 from The Whole House by Jane Addams.
Yes, let's start with a little introduction. Jane Addams was an American social worker, social reformer, and a pacifist. During a second trip to Europe, she became acquainted with the shelter in the slums in London. Back in America, Jane Addams founded a similar shelter in Chicago in 1889 with her friend Ellen Starr. This institution was housed in the Whole House building on Halsted Street. The Whole House quickly grew into a large and important center for Chicago's poorest residents. Adams and her associates provided courses in money management, child care, and health, among other things. In addition, projects were started to help the unemployed find work.
The next January found Miss Starr and myself in Chicago, searching for a neighborhood in which we might put our plans into execution. In our eagerness to win friends for the new undertaking, we utilized every opportunity to set forth the meaning of the settlement as it has been embodied at Toynbee Hall. Although in those days we made no appeal for money, meaning to start with our own slender resources. From the very first, the plan received courteous attention, and the discussion, while often skeptical, was always friendly. Professor Swain wrote a commendatory column in the Evening Journal, and our early speeches were reported quite out of proportion to the worth. I recall a spirited evening at the home of Mrs. Wilmers, which was attended by that renewed scholar, Thomas Davidson, and by a young Englishman who was a member of the then new Fabian Society, and to whom a peculiar glamour was attached because he had sourced knives all summer in a camp of high-minded philosophers in the Adirondacks. Our new little plan met with criticism, not to say disapproval, from Mr. Davidson, who, as nearly as I can remember, called it one of those unnatural attempts to understand life through cooperative living. It was in vain we asserted that the collective living was not an essential part of the plan, that we would always scrupulously pay our own expenses, and that at any moment we might decide to scatter through the neighborhood and to live in separate tenements. He still contended that the fascination for most of those volunteering residents would lie in the collective living aspect of the settlement. His contention was, of course, essentially sound. There is a constant tendency for the residents to lose themselves in the cave of their own companionship, as the Toynbee Hall phrase goes, but on the other hand, it is doubtless true that the very companionship, the give and take of colleagues, is what tends to keep the settlement normal and in touch with the world of things as they are. I'm happy to say that we never resented this nor any other difference of opinion, and that 15 years later Professor Davidson handsomely acknowledged that the advantages of a group far outweighed the weakness he had early pointed out. He was at that later moment sharing with a group of young men on the east side of New York his robust conclusions in philosophy, and was much touched by their intelligent interest and absorbed devotion. I think that time has also justified our early contention that the mere foothold of a house, easily accessible, ample in space, hospitable and tolerant in spirit, situated in the midst of the large foreign colonies which so easily isolate themselves in American cities, would be in itself a serviceable thing for Chicago. I am not so sure that we succeeded in our endeavors to make social intercourse express the growing sense of the economic unity of society and to add the social function of democracy. But Hull House was soberly opened on the theory that the dependence of classes on each other is reciprocal, and that is, the social relation is essentially a reciprocal relation. It gives a form of expression that he peculiar value.
In our search for vicinity in which to settle, we went about with the officers of the compulsory education department, with city missionaries, and with the newspaper reporters from whom I recall as a much older set of men that one ordinarily associated with the profession. Or perhaps I was only sent out with the older ones on what they must all have considered as quixotic mission. One Sunday afternoon in the late winter, a reporter took me to visit a so-called anarchist Sunday school, several of which were to be found on the northwest side of the city. The young man in charge was of the German student type, and his face flushed with enthusiasm as he led the children singing one of Korner's poems. The newspaperman, who did not understand German, asked me what abominable stuff they were singing, but he seemed dissatisfied with my translation of the simple words and darkly intimated that they were deep ones and had probably fooled me. When I replied that Korner was an ardent German poet whose songs inspired his countrymen to resist the aggressions of Napoleon, and that his bound poems were found in the most respectable libraries, he looked at me rather askance, and I then and there had my first intimation that the threat of a Chicago man who is called an anarchist, as you would treat any other citizen, is to lay yourself open to deep suspicion. Another Sunday afternoon in the early spring, on the way to a Bohemian mission in the carriage of one of its founders, we passed a fine old house standing well back from the street, surrounded on three sides by a broad piazza, which was supported by wooden pillars and exceptionally pure, coherent design and proportion. I was so attracted by the house that I set forth to visit it the very next day. But though I searched for it then and for several days after, I could not find it. And at length, I most reluctantly gave up the search. 3 weeks later, with the advice of several of the oldest residents of Chicago, including the ex-mayor of the city, Colonel Mason, who had from the first been a warm friend to our plans, we decided upon a location somewhere near the junction of Blue Island Avenue, Halsted Hall Street, and Harrison Street. I was surprised and overjoyed on the very first day of our search for quarters to come upon the hospitable old house, the guest for which I had so recently abandoned. The house was of course rented, the lower part of it used for offices and storerooms in connection with a factory that stood back of it. However, after some difficulties were overcome, it proved to be possible to sublet the second floor and what had been a large drawing room on the first floor. The house had passed through many changes since it had been built in 1856 for the homestead of one of Chicago's pioneer citizens, Mr. Charles G. Hull, and although bettered by its vicissitudes and was essentially sound. Before it had been occupied by the factory, it had sheltered a second-hand furniture store, and at one time the Little Sisters of the Poor had used it from a home for the aged. It had a half-skeptical reputation for a haunted attic, so far respected by the tenants living on the second floor that they always kept a large pitcher full of water on the attic stairs. Their explanation of this custom was so incoherent that I was sure that it was a survival of the belief that a ghost could not cross running water. But perhaps that interpretation was only my eagerness for finding folklore. The fine old house responded kindly to repairs, its wide hall and open fireplace always ensuring it a gracious aspect. Its generous owner, Miss Helen Culver, in the following spring gave us a free leasehold of the entire house. Her kindness has continued through the years until the group of 13 buildings, which at present comprises our equipment, is built largely upon land which Miss Culver has put at the service of the settlement which bears Mr. Hull's name. In those days the house stood between an undertaking establishment and a saloon. Night, Death, and the Devil. The three were called by Chicago wit, and yet any mock heroics which might be implied by comparing the settlement to a night quickly dropped away under the genuine kindness and hearty welcome extended to us by the families living up and down the street. We furnished the house, and as we would have furnished it were it in another part of the city with the photographs and other impedimenta, we had collected in Europe, and with a few bits of family mahogany. While all the new furniture which was bought was enduring in quality, we were careful to keep it in character with a fine old residence. Probably no young matron ever placed her own things in her own house with more pleasure than that with which we first furnished her whole house. We believe that the settlement may logically bring to its aid all those adjuncts which the cultivated man regards as good and suggestive of the best of the life of the past.
On the 18th of September 1889, Miss Starr and I moved into it with Miss Mary Keyser, who began performing the housework but who quickly developed into a very important factor in the life of the vicinity as well as that of the household, and whose death 5 years later was most sincerely mourned by hundreds of our neighbors. In our enthusiasm over settling the first night, we forgot not only to lock but to close a side door opening on Polk Street, and we were much pleased in the morning to find that we possessed a fine illustration of the honesty and kindliness of our new neighbors. Our first guest was an interesting young woman who lived in a neighboring tenement, whose widowed mother aided her in the support of the family by scrubbing a downtown theater every night. The mother, of English birth, was well bred and carefully educated, but was in the midst of that bitter struggle which awaits so many strangers in American cities who find that their social position tends to be measured solely by the standards of living they are able to maintain. Our guest has long since married the struggling young lawyer to whom she was then engaged, and he is now leading his profession in an eastern city. She recalls that month's experience always with a sense of amusement over the fact that the succession of visitors who came to see the new settlement invariably questioned her most minutely concerning these people, without once suspecting that they were talking to one who had been identified with the neighborhood from childhood. I at least was able to draw a lesson from the incident, and I never addressed a Chicago audience on the subject of the settlement and its vicinity without inviting a neighbor to go with me, that I might curb any hasty generalization by the consciousness that I had an auditor who knew the conditions more intimately than I could hope for. Halsted Street has grown so familiar during 20 years of residence that it's difficult to recall its gradual changes. The withdrawal of the more prosperous Irish and Germans, and the slow substitution of Russian Jews, Italians, and Greeks. A description of the street such as I gave in those early addresses still stands in my mind as sympathetic and correct. Halsted Street is 32 miles long and one of the great thoroughfares of Chicago. Polk Street crosses it midway between the stockyard to the south and the shipbuilding yards on the north branch of the Chicago River. For the 6 miles between these two industries, the street is lined with shops and butchers and grocers, with dingy and gorgeous saloons, and pretentious establishments for the sale of ready-made clothing. Polk Street, running west from Halsted Street, grows rapidly more prosperous. Running a mile east to State Street, it grows steadily worse and crosses a network of vice on the corners of Clark Street and Fifth Avenue. Hull House once stood in the suburbs, but the city has steadily grown up around it, and its site now has corners on 3 or 4 foreign colonies. Between Halsted Street and the river live about 10,000 Italian Neapolitans, Sicilians, and Calabrians, with an occasional Lombard of Venetian. To the south of 12th Street are many Germans, and side streets are given over almost entirely to Polish and Russian Jews. Still farther south, these Jewish colonies merge into a huge Bohemian colony, so vast that Chicago ranks as the third Bohemian city in the world. To the northwest are many Canadian French, clannish in spite of their long residence in America, and to the north are Irish and first-generation Americans. On the streets directly west and further north are well-to-do English-speaking families, many of whom own their own houses and have lived in the neighborhood for years. One man is still living in his old farmhouse. The policy of the public authorities of never taking an initiative and always waiting to be urged to do their duty is obviously fatal in a neighborhood where there is little initiative among the citizens. The idea underlying our self-government breaks down in such a ward. The streets are inexpressibly dirty, the number of schools inadequate, sanitary legislation unenforced, the street lighting bad, the paving miserable and altogether lacking in the alleys and smaller streets, and the stables full beyond description. Hundreds of houses are unconnected with the street sewers. The older and richer inhabitants seem anxious to move away as rapidly as they can afford it. They make room for newly arrived immigrants who are densely ignorant of civic duties. This substitution of the older inhabitants is accomplished industrially also in the south and east quarters of the ward. The Jews and Italians do the finishing for the great clothing manufacturers, formerly done by Americans, Irish, and Germans who refuse to submit to the extremely low prices to which the sweating system has reduced their successors. As the design of the sweating system is the elimination of rent from the manufacture of clothing, the outside work is begun after the clothing leaves the cutter. An unscrupulous contractor regards no basement as too dark, no stable loft too foul, no rare shanty too provisional, no tenement room too small for his work room, as these conditions imply low rental. Hence these shops abound in the worst of the foreign districts, where the sweater easily finds his cheap basement and his home finishers. The house of the ward, for most part wooden, were originally built for one family and are now occupied by several. They are after the type of the inconvenient frame cottages found in the poorer suburbs 20 years ago. Many of them were built where they now stand. Others were built tighter on rollers because the previous sites has been taken by factories. The fewer brick tenements buildings, which are 3 or 4 stories high, are comparatively new, and there are few large tenements. The little wooden houses have a temporary aspect, and for this reason, perhaps the tenement house legislation in Chicago is totally inadequate. Rear tenements flourish. Many houses have no water supply save the faucet in the backyard. There are no fire escapes. The garbage and the ashes are placed in wooden boxes which are fastened to the street pavement. One of the most discouraging features about the present system of tenement houses is that many are owned by sordid and ignorant immigrants. The theory that wealth brings responsibility, that possession entails at length education and refinement, in these cases fails utterly. The children of an Italian immigrant owner may shine shoes in the street, and his wife may pick rags from the street gutter, laboriously sorting them in a dingy court. Wealth may do something for her complacency and feeling of consequence. It certainly does nothing for her comfort or her children's improvement, nor for the cleanliness of anyone concerned. Another thing that prevents better houses in Chicago is the tentative attitude of the real estate man. Many unsavory conditions are allowed to continue which would be regarded with horror if they were considered permanent. Meanwhile, wretched conditions persist until at least 2 generations of children have been born and reared in them.
Okay, so now we do a little part of what we think about the text, and we are noticing that Jane Addams can describe everything in much detail. So she was really living with these people and knows all these different examples of how they live there and how the street is built, and it's has come to her attention that she can know.
Yeah, that she describes everything in a lot of detail, and it looks a little bit like it's her diary,
Yeah.
this book, because she has so many of her own examples and the way she sees things, and she just tells it how it is, and we can really tell that she raises her voice for poorer people, and that she doesn't really look at where they come from. There are a lot of different societies, and there are a lot of different nationalities like Italian and Greek and German and Irish and also American, and they can all live there, and everyone is welcome to come there.
Yeah. And the interesting part is that the whole house is like in the center, and the whole city is built upon around the whole house, and that makes it so good because it's they are not really divided and living in the suburbs, and it's really
It's very inclusive in that way.
it's very inclusive.
Because they they used to be in the suburbs, but when the city Chicago grew, then now they are more like inside of the society and still in Chicago society. So it's good that they're in that way are more part of the society and not just excluded out of the
Yeah,
city and living their own little life.
yeah, yeah. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to the text. We are on halfway now, so I will continue. In every neighborhood where poor people live, because rents are supposed to be cheaper there, is an element which, although uncertain in the individual, in the aggregate, can be counted upon. It is composed of people of former education and opportunity who have cherished ambitions and prospects, but who are caricatures of what they meant to be, hollow ghosts which blame the living man. There are times in many lives when there is a cessation of energy and loss of power. Men and women of education and refinement come to live in a cheaper neighborhood because they lack the ability to make money because of ill health, because of an unfortunate marriage, or for other reasons which do not imply criminality or stupidity. Among them are those who, in spite of untoward circumstances, keep up some sort of an intellectual life, those who are great for books, as their neighbors say. To such, the settlement may be a genuine refugee. In the very first weeks of her residence, Miss Starr started a reading party in George Eliot's Romola, which was attended by a group of young women who followed the wonderful tale with unflagging interest. The weekly reading was held in our little upstairs dining room, and two members of the club came to dinner each week, not only that they might be received as guests, but that they might help us wash the dishes afterwards and so make the table ready for the stacks of Florentine photographs. Our first resident, as she gaily designed herself, was a charming old lady who gave five consecutive readings from Hawthorne to a most appreciative audience, interspersing the magic tales most delightfully with recollections of the elusive and fascinating author. Years before she had lived at Brook Farm as a pupil of the Ripleys, and she came to us for 10 days because she wished to live once more in an atmosphere where idealism ran high. We thus early found the type of class which, through all the years, has remained most popular, a combination of a social atmosphere with serious study. Volunteers to the new undertaking came quickly. A charming young girl conducted a kindergarten in a drawing room, coming regularly every morning from her home in a distant part of the north side of the city. Although a tablet of her to her memory has stood upon a mantel shelf in Hull House for 5 years, we still associate her most vividly with the play of little children, first in her kindergarten and then in our own nursery, which furnished a veritable illustration of Victor Hugo's definition of heaven, a place where parents are always young and children always little. Her daily presence for the first 2 years made it quite impossible for us to become too solemn and self conscious in our strenuous routine. For her, mirth and buoyancy were irresistible, and her eager desire to share the life of the neighborhood never failed, although it was often put at a severe test. One day at luncheon, she gaily recited her futile attempt to impress temperance principles upon the minds of an Italian mother, to whom she had returned a small daughter of 5 sent to the kindergarten in quite a horrid state of intoxication, from the wine-soaked bread upon which she had breakfast. The mother, with the gentle courtesy of a South Italian, listened politely to her graphic portrayal of the antimili and awaiting so immature a wine bibber. Not long before the lecture was finished, quite unconscious of the incongruity, she hospitably set forth her best wines, and when her baffled baffled guest refused one after the other, she disappeared, only to quickly return with a small dark glass of wine, saying reassuringly, "See, I have brought you the true American drink." The recital ended in seriocomic despair, with the rueful statement that the impression I probably made on her darkened mind was that it was the American custom to breakfast children on bread soaked in whiskey instead of light Italian wine. That first kindergarten was a constant source of education to us. We were much surprised to find social distinctions even among its lambs, although greatly amused with the neat formulation made by the superior little Italian boy who refused to sit beside uncouth little Angela because we eat our macaroni like this, imitating the movement of a fork from a plate to his mouth, and she eat her macaroni this way, holding his hand high in the air and throwing back his head that his wide open mouth might receive an imaginary cascade. Angela gravely nodded her little head in approval of this distinction between gentry and peasant. But isn't it astonishing that merely table manners are made such a test all the way along? Was the comment of their democratic teacher. Another memory which refuses to be associated with death, and which came to her all too soon, is that of a young girl who organized our first really successful club of boys, holding their fascinated interest by the old chivalric tales set forth so dramatically and vividly that checkers and jockstraws were abandoned by all other clubs on boys' days, that their members might from a listening fringe to the young heroes. I met a member of the latter club one day as he flung himself out of the house in the rage by which an emotional boy hopes to keep from shedding tears. "There is no use coming here anymore, Prince Roland is dead," he gruffly explained as we passed. We encouraged the younger boys in tournaments and dramatics of all sorts, and we somewhat fatuously believed that the boys who were early interested in adventures or explorers might later want to know the lives of living statesmen and investors. It is needless to add that the boys quickly responded to such a program, and that the only difficult law lay in finding leaders who were able to carry it out. This difficulty has been with us through all the years of growth and development in the Boys Club until now, with its 5-story building, its splendid equipment of shops, of recreation and study rooms. That group alone is successful with comments and the services of a resourceful and devoted leader. The dozens of younger children who from the first came to the whole house were organized into groups which were not quite classes and quite clubs. The value of these groups consisted almost entirely in arousing a higher imagination and in giving the children the opportunity which they could not have in crowded schools for initiative and for independent social relationship. The public schools then contained little handwork of any sort, so that naturally and any instruction which we provided for the children took the direction of this supplementary work. but it required a constant effort that the pressure of the poverty itself should not defeat the educational aim. The Italian girls in the sewing classes would count the days lost when they could not carry home a garment, and the insistence that it should be neatly made seemed a super refinement to those in dire need of clothing.
As these clubs have been continued during the 20 years that they have developed classes in the many forms of handcraft which the newer education is so rapidly adapting for the delight of children, but they still keep their essentially social character and still minister to that large number of children who leave school the very week they are 14 years old, only too eager to close the schoolroom door forever on a tiresome task that is at last well over. It seems to us important that these children shall find themselves permanently attached to a house that offers them evening clubs and classes with their old companions, that merges as easily as possible the school life into the working life, and does what it can to find places for the bewildering young things looking for work. A large proportion of the delinquent boys brought into the juvenile court in Chicago are the oldest sons in large families whose wages are needed at home. The grades from which many of them leave schools, as the records show, are piteously far from the seventh and eighth, where the very first introduction in manual training is given, nor have they been caught by any other abiding interest. In spite of these flourishing clubs for children are established at Hull House, and the fact that our first organized undertaking was a kindergarten, we were very insistent that the settlement should not be primarily for children, and that it was absurd to suppose that grown people would not respond to opportunities for education and social life. Our enthusiastic kindergarten gardener herself demonstrated this with an old woman of 90 who, because she was left alone all day while her daughter cooked in a restaurant, had formed such a persistent habit of picking the plaster off the walls that one landlord after another refused to have her for a tenant. It required but a few weeks' time to teach her to make large paper chains, and gradually she was content to do it all day long, and in the end took quite as much pleasure in adorning the walls as she had formerly taken in demolishing them. Fortunately, the landlord had never heard the aesthetic principle that exposure of basic construction is more desirable than gaudy decoration. In course of time, it was discovered that the old woman could speak Gaelic, and when one or two grave professors came to see her, the neighborhood was filled with pride that such a wonder lived in their midst. To mitigate life for a woman of 90 was an unfailing refutation of the statement that the settlement was designed for the young. On our first New Year's Day at Hull House, we invited the older people in the vicinity, sending on carriage for the most feeble, and announcing to all of them that we were going to organize an old settlers party. Every New Year's Day since, older people in varying numbers have come together at Hull House to relate early hardship and to take for the moment the place in the community to which their pioneer life entitles them. Many people who are formerly residents of the vicinity, to whom prosperity has carried into more desirable neighborhoods, come back to these meetings and often confess to each other that they have never since found such kindness in an early Chicago, when all its citizens came together in mutual enterprises. Many of these pioneers, so like the men and women of my earliest childhood that I always felt comforted by their presence in the house, were very much opposed to foreigners, whom they held responsible for a depreciation of uh, property and the general lowering of the tone of the neighborhood. Sometimes we had the chance for a championship. I recall one man, fiercely American, who had reproached me because we had so many foreign views on our walls, to whom I endeavored to set forth our hope that the pictures might afford a familiar island to the immigrants in the sea of the new strange impressions. The old settler guest, taken off his guard, replied, I see they feel as we did between the pioneer and the immigrant, both buffeting the waves of a new development. The older settlers, as well as their children, throughout the years have given genuine help to our various enterprises for neighborhood improvement, and from their own memories of early hardship have made many shrewd suggestions of alleviating the difficulties of that first sharp struggle with untoward conditions. In those early days, we were often asked why we had come to live on Halston Street when we could afford to live somewhere else. I remember one man who used to shake his head and say it was the strangest thing he had met in his experience, but who was finally convinced that it was not strange but natural. In time, it came to seem natural to all of us that the settlement should be there. If it is natural to feed the hungry and care for the sick, it is certainly natural to give pleasure to the young, comfort to the aged, and to minister to the deep-seated craving for social intercourse that all men feel. Whoever does it is rewarded by something which, if not gratitude, is at least spontaneous and vital and lacks that irksome sense of obligation with which a substantial benefit is too often acknowledged. In addition to the neighbors who responded to the receptions in classes, we found those who were too battered and oppressed to care for them. To these, however, we left that susceptibility to the bare officers of humanity which raises such offices into a bond of fellowship. From the first it seemed understood that we were ready to perform the humblest neighborhood services. We were asked to wash the newborn babies and to prepare the dead for burial, to nurse the sick, and to mind the children. Occasionally these neighborly offices unexpectedly uncovered ugly human traits. For 6 weeks after an operation, we kept in one of our 3 bedrooms a forlorn little baby who, because she was born with a cleft palate, was most unwelcome even to his mother, and we were horrified when he died of neglect a week after he was returned to his home. A little Italian bride of 15 sought shelter with us one November evening to escape her husband who had beaten her every night for a week when he returned home from work. Because she had lost her wedding ring, 2 of us officiated quite alone at the birth of an illegitimate, illegitimate child because the doctor was late in arriving, and none of the honest Irish matrons would touch her the likes of her. We ministered at the deathbed of a young man who, during a long illness of tuberculosis, had received so many bottles of whiskey through the mistaken kindness of his friend that the cumulative effect produced wild periods of exhalation, in one of which he died. We were also early impressed with the curious isolation of many of the immigrants. An Italian woman once expressed her pleasure in the red roses that she saw at one of our receptions in surprise that they had been brought so fresh all the way from Italy. She would not believe for an instant that they had been grown in America. She said that she had lived in Chicago for 6 years and had never seen any roses, whereas in Italy she had seen them every summer in great profusion. During all that time, of course, the woman had lived within 10 blocks of a florist window. She had not been more than 5-cent car ride away from the public parks, but she had never dreamed of faring forth for herself, and not one had taken her. Her conception of America had been the untidy street in which she lived, and had made her long struggle to adapt herself to American ways. But in spite of some untoward experiences, we were constantly impressed with the uniform kindness and courtesy we received. Perhaps these first days laid the simple human foundation which, as certain essential of continuous living among the poor, first genuine preference for residence in an industrial quarter to any other part of the city, because it is interesting and makes the human appeal, and second to the conviction, in the words of Canon Barnett, that the things that make men alike are finer and better than the things that keep them apart, and that these basic likenesses, if they are properly accentuated, easily transcend the less essential differences of race, language, creed, and tradition. Perhaps even in those first days we made a beginning toward that object, which was afterwards stated in our charter, to provide a center for higher civic and social life, to institute and maintain education and philanthropic enterprises, and to investigate and improve the conditions in the industrial districts of Chicago.
Okay, this was the text. So we're gonna comment on it, and we both think that she's such an interesting woman because her drive, she wants to do so good for the poor people, but not only the poor people.
Yeah, also children, younger people, elderly, all ages that can go to the center and go to a whole house and be with other people and um, really like be a society and be part of a community as well. I think it's good to see that they arrange a lot of activities where people can come together and talk with each other and just have a good time. And then also still having the whole house where they care for people and where they, like she said, birth children because the doctors can be there and even prepare deaf people to be buried after, or yeah.
And it's so nice that you can really read the pureness of her, and that she's really part of it and not really just make the houses and then left or something. She's really part of the whole kind of community feeling,
the whole development, and
yeah,
she has been through a large development with how she started and how the whole house is at this time. So yeah, she is a very interesting and special woman, and I think she put up such a good settlement, and
yeah, Minnie really made a big change for everybody.
Yeah, I think so too.
Super interesting.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, thank you very much
for listening. This was our book club, and we hope you thought it was interesting and that you liked it.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.